The morning light streamed through the blinds of Elaine Porter's home office as she sipped her coffee, scrolling through her emails before heading to the hospital for her shift. As the chief of cardiology at Memorial General, her mornings always started early, a routine she had maintained for the last 15 years. At 45, Elaine had built everything she had ever dreamed of: a successful career, a beautiful home in the suburbs of Boston, and what she thought was a rock-solid marriage to investment banker Richard Porter, that is, until she opened an email with the subject line, "It's time we face reality." The coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor as she stared at the screen. There they were: divorce papers, already signed by Richard, and a photo that burned itself into her retina. Richard, her husband of 2 decades, standing with his arm around a young woman who couldn't be older than 23, both of them smiling in front of the fireplace at their vacation home in Vermont, the home they had bought together after years of saving, the home where they had planned to retire someday. The young woman was beautiful, with flowing blonde hair and the kind of effortless smile that only comes with youth. And the way Richard looked at her, Elaine hadn't seen that look in his eyes for years. "I found happiness with Amber," the email read. "I think we both know our marriage has been over for a long time. I'm tired of pretending. The papers are ready, all you need to do is sign. I'm not coming back to Boston. This is goodbye." 20 years of marriage, dismissed in a 3-paragraph email and a photo that felt like a knife to her heart. No warning. No discussion. Just the cold, hard truth that while she had been building her career, saving lives, and believing in their shared future, Richard had been building a separate life without her. Elaine's phone buzzed. It was the hospital. A cardiac emergency requiring her immediate attention. Somehow, she found the strength to stand, to wipe her tears, to change out of her coffee-stained clothes. Because that's who Elaine Porter was: a woman who had never allowed life's challenges to break her. Not when she lost her parents in college, not during the grueling years of medical school, and not now. Little did she know that this email, this devastating betrayal, would be the catalyst for a journey that would not only redefine her understanding of love and forgiveness but would lead her to discover a strength within herself that she never knew existed. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of emotions: shock, grief, anger, confusion. Elaine moved through her days on autopilot, performing surgeries with the same precision she always had, making life-or-death decisions without hesitation. But inside, she was slowly falling apart. "You need to get a lawyer," Elaine, her best friend and fellow doctor, Sophia Martinez, insisted over dinner at Elaine's kitchen table. "That bastard can't just walk away with half of everything you've built. Especially not after what he's done." Elaine stared at the untouched plate of takeout in front of her. 20 years, Sophia. 20 years, and he couldn't even tell me to my face. "Because he's a coward," Sophia said, refilling their wine glasses. A midlife crisis wrapped in designer suits who couldn't handle being married to a woman more successful than him. But despite Sophia's insistence, Elaine couldn't bring herself to call a lawyer. Not yet. Something didn't add up. The Richard she had married wouldn't have done this, wouldn't have been so cruel, so callous. They had grown apart, yes. Their careers had taken them in different directions. The passion had cooled. But there had been respect, hadn't there? There had been love, even if it had evolved into something more comfortable, less fiery. Late that night, unable to sleep in the bed they had shared for so many years, Elaine found herself scrolling through old photos on her laptop. Richard on their honeymoon in Greece. Richard holding her hand at her medical school graduation. Richard helping her father in the garden before he passed away. Small moments that had built a life together, and then she saw it, a folder she hadn't opened in years. Vermont dreams. Photos of them working on the vacation home, painting walls, planting the garden, sitting on the porch watching the sunset. She clicked through them, each image a fresh wound, until she reached the last one, a photo of Richard standing in front of the fireplace, the same fireplace from the email, holding up the house keys on the day they had finally paid off the mortgage. Something in his eyes in that old photo caught her attention. The same look he had given the young woman, Amber. But back then, that look had been for Elaine, before she could stop herself, Elaine was booking a flight to Vermont. She needed to see it for herself. Needed to face Richard in person, to look him in the eyes when he told her their marriage was over. She needed closure, not a coldly worded email and divorce papers. "This is insane," Sophia said when Elaine called to tell her the plan. "He's there with her. What do you think you're going to accomplish?" "I don't know," Elaine admitted. "But I can't sign those papers without trying to understand what happened to us. I owe myself that much." The flight to Burlington was short, but the drive to their vacation home in the Green Mountains seemed endless. With each mile, Elaine's determination wavered. What if Richard refused to see her? What if seeing them together broke something in her that couldn't be fixed? As she pulled up to the familiar cedar-shingled house, Elaine noticed something strange. Richard's car was there, but the house looked dark, empty. No smoke from the chimney despite the chill in the air. No lights in the windows. With her heart pounding, Elaine used the key she had never thought to surrender, and pushed open the front door. "Richard," she called into the darkness. No answer. The house was cold, as if it had been empty for days. Elaine moved through the rooms, turning on lights, looking for signs of life, signs of the new couple who had claimed this space as their own. But there was nothing. No young woman's clothes, no evidence that anyone had been living there recently. And then she saw it: Richard's laptop, open on the kitchen table. Next to it, an empty bottle of whiskey and a glass. Against her better judgment, against everything she believed about privacy and trust, Elaine sat down and touched the spacebar. The screen came to life, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Emails. Dozens of them. From banks, from clients, from the investment firm's board of directors. Words jumped out at her: investigation, securities fraud, misappropriation of funds, criminal charges pending. And one email, sent to Amber Lawson, with the subject line, "I can't do this anymore." Elaine's hands trembled as she opened it. "Amber, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I can't face what's coming. The investigation, the charges, the shame. I've lost everything: my reputation, my career, and now you. I know you only wanted me for the money, for the lifestyle I promised you. I don't blame you. I wanted you because you made me feel young again, powerful, when everything else in my life was falling apart. I've sent divorce papers to Elaine. She deserves better than to be dragged down with me. Take care of yourself. Richard." The email was dated 3 days ago. Panic rising in her throat, Elaine called Richard's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. She searched the house, calling his name, looking for any clue about where he might have gone. In their bedroom, the closet door stood open, Richard's clothes still hanging inside, untouched. On the nightstand, his watch and wallet and a note. Her name written in his familiar handwriting. With shaking hands, Elaine unfolded it. "Elaine, I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. 20 years together, and I couldn't find the courage to tell you the truth that I've lost everything. The firm is under investigation. I made some bad investments, tried to cover them up, crossed lines I never thought I would cross. It all spiraled out of control. I couldn't tell you. Couldn't bear to see the disappointment in your eyes. Amber was a mistake. A desperate attempt to feel something other than failure. She's gone now, left as soon as she realized there was no money left. I don't blame her. What could I offer her? What can I offer anyone now? By the time you read this, I'll be at the cliff by the lake. You remember it, where we used to watch the stars during our first summer here. I always felt closest to who I really am when I was there with you. I need to think, to decide what comes next. I don't know if I have the strength to face what's waiting for me. I'm sorry, Elaine. For everything. You deserved so much better than me." Richard. Elaine dropped the note, her mind racing. The cliff by the lake. A quiet spot overlooking the water, but a dangerous one, a sheer drop of at least 60 feet onto the rocks below. Without thinking twice, she grabbed her car keys and ran. The drive to the lake took only 15 minutes, but each second felt like an eternity. The sky had darkened, clouds gathering, mirroring the storm in Elaine's heart. Rain began to fall as she parked the car and ran along the familiar trail toward the cliff. "Richard," she called, her voice nearly lost in the wind that had begun to pick up. "Richard, where are you?" And then she saw him, a lone figure standing at the edge of the cliff, staring out at the churning waters of the lake below. Even from a distance, Elaine could see how his shoulders slumped, defeated in a way she had never seen before. "Richard," she said, more softly now, approaching slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might startle him. "Step back from the edge. Please." He turned, and the look on his face nearly broke her. This wasn't the confident, sometimes arrogant man she had married. This was someone hollowed out by shame and despair. "Elaine." Confusion crossed his features. "What are you doing here? You weren't supposed to. You should have just signed the papers. And let you face this alone." Elaine took another careful step forward. 20 years, Richard. Did you really think I would just walk away?" "You should," he said, his voice breaking. "I've lost everything. The firm, our savings, my reputation. It's all gone. I'm facing prison, Elaine. Prison. And I dragged another woman into this mess because I was too weak, too afraid to face what I'd done." "Tell me what happened," Elaine said, taking another step closer. She was only a few feet away from him now, close enough to see the tears mingling with the rain on his face. "The whole truth, Richard. I deserve that much." And so, standing on the edge of the cliff, with the rain soaking them both to the skin, Richard finally told her everything. How the pressure to perform at the firm had led him to make increasingly risky investments. How he had used client funds to cover losses, believing he could replace them before anyone noticed. How the house of cards had finally collapsed, and now federal investigators were building a case against him. "And Amber?" Elaine asked, the name still bitter on her tongue. Richard looked away. "I met her at a conference 6 months ago. She was young, impressed by me, made me feel like I wasn't a failure. It was never serious, at least, not for me. I think I was trying to escape, to pretend I was someone else for a while. When she realized there was no money, that there would be no more luxury hotels or expensive gifts, she left. Can't say I blame her." "So you sent me divorce papers? To protect me?" "To spare you the humiliation," Richard said. "Your career, your reputation. I couldn't let my mistakes drag you down too. Everyone's going to know soon. It'll be in the papers, on the news. Investment banker faces fraud charges. I thought it would be easier for you if you were already gone. If you could tell everyone we had separated before all this came out." "Easier?" Elaine's voice rose despite her effort to stay calm. "You thought it would be easier to receive divorce papers and a photo of you with another woman? To believe that after 20 years, you had simply replaced me without a second thought?" Richard winced. "The photo was Amber's idea. She sent it to me, asked me to forward it to you. Said it would make you hate me enough to sign the papers quickly. I was desperate, not thinking clearly. I'm sorry, Elaine. I know it's not enough, but I am truly sorry." The rain was falling harder now, the wind whipping around them. Elaine was shivering, but she didn't move away. "Step back from the edge, Richard," she said quietly. "Whatever happens next, this isn't the answer." "What is the answer, then?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the storm. "I've destroyed everything we built. I betrayed your trust in every possible way. There's nothing left." "There's me," Elaine said, extending her hand toward him. "I'm still here." For a long moment, Richard didn't move. The rain continued to pour, lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the despair on his face. Then, slowly, he reached out and took Elaine's hand. She pulled him gently away from the edge, back toward solid ground. They walked in silence back to her car, both soaked to the skin, both lost in their own thoughts. The drive back to the vacation house was quiet, the only sound the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers battling the downpour. Inside, Elaine built a fire while Richard changed into dry clothes. She found some of her old clothes still in the dresser drawer, clothes from happier times, from weekends spent hiking in the mountains or reading by the fire. They felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone whose life hadn't just imploded. "You should go back to Boston," Richard said as they sat in front of the fire, mugs of hot tea warming their hands. "Forget about me, about all of this. Tell everyone I betrayed you. It's the truth, anyway. Is that what you want?" Elaine asked, studying his face. "What I want doesn't matter anymore," Richard replied. "But you deserve a chance to walk away from this mess with your dignity intact." Elaine was quiet for a long moment, sipping her tea, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. The same fireplace where Richard had stood with Amber in that devastating photo. The same fireplace where they had shared so many winter evenings over the years. "You know," she finally said, "when I got that email, I thought I knew exactly what had happened. That you had found someone younger, more exciting, less busy. That you had grown tired of a wife who spent more time at the hospital than at home." "Elaine, let me finish," she said gently. "I blamed myself. Wondered what I could have done differently. If I had been more present, more attentive. If I had taken more time away from work. If I had somehow failed you as a wife." Richard looked stricken. "No, Elaine. Never. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. This was my failure, not yours. The thing is," Elaine continued, "I didn't just come here for answers. I came here because despite that email, despite that photo, despite everything, I couldn't reconcile the man who would do those things with the man I married. The man I've known for 20 years. People change," Richard said quietly. "Sometimes not for the better." "Yes, they do," Elaine agreed. "But there's also this: in 20 years together, I've seen you make mistakes. I've seen you fail. I've seen you at your worst. But I've never known you to be deliberately cruel. That email wasn't you, Richard. It was your shame talking. Your fear." Richard looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "What difference does it make now? The result is the same. I've still destroyed our lives." "Not yet, you haven't," Elaine said firmly. "Yes, you made terrible mistakes. Yes, there will be consequences. Serious ones. But running away isn't the answer. Neither is," she glanced toward the window, in the direction of the cliff. "Neither is ending things." "What are you saying?" Richard asked, a flicker of something not quite hope, but perhaps the prerequisite for it in his eyes. "I'm saying that tomorrow morning, we're going to call a lawyer. A good one. You're going to tell them everything, every decision, every mistake, every detail. And then you're going to cooperate with the investigation. You're going to face the consequences of your actions. And you?" Elaine took a deep breath. "I don't know yet. I can't promise you that our marriage will survive this. The betrayal, the lies, the other woman, that's a lot to process, a lot to forgive. But I do know this: I won't make any decisions about our future based on an email sent out of shame and desperation. I deserve better than that. We both do." For the first time that day, Richard's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with self-pity. "Why would you even consider standing by me through this? After what I've done?" Elaine thought about it for a moment. "Because 20 years ago, I made a vow: for better or for worse. We've had a lot of the better. Now we're facing the worse. I'm not saying I'm staying. I'm saying I'm not running away. There's a difference." That night, they slept in separate rooms, Elaine in the master bedroom, Richard on the couch. Both lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm that continued to rage outside, mirroring the turmoil in their hearts. In the morning, the rain had stopped. A tentative sun broke through the clouds as Elaine made coffee and Richard sat at the kitchen table, making a list of names: his clients, his colleagues, everyone affected by his actions. "The first step is to know exactly what we're dealing with," Elaine said, setting a mug of coffee in front of him. "Full disclosure, Richard. No more secrets." He nodded, the weight of what lay ahead visible in the slump of his shoulders, but there was something else there too, a resolve that had been missing yesterday. The desperate man on the cliff edge was gone, replaced by someone prepared to face what was coming. They spent the day making calls to lawyers, to accountants, to the firm's ethics committee. With each call, the picture became clearer, the path forward more defined. Yes, Richard would face charges. Yes, there would likely be a trial, possibly prison time. His career in finance was over. Their savings would go toward restitution and legal fees, but there was also this: some of Richard's clients were willing to speak on his behalf, to acknowledge his years of ethical service before the mistakes began. The firm, while unable to protect him from the consequences of his actions, recognized that he had come forward voluntarily, that he was cooperating fully. "It won't be easy," the lawyer said in their final call of the day. "But it's not as hopeless as you thought, Mr. Porter. The fact that you've come forward, that you're willing to make amends, it counts for something." After the call ended, Richard and Elaine sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything they had learned. "What happens now?" Richard finally asked. "Between us, I mean." Elaine considered the question carefully. "Now, I go back to Boston. I have patients who need me, a department to run. And you stay here, work with the lawyers, prepare for what's coming." "And us?" There was no demand in the question, no expectation, just a quiet hope. "I don't know yet," Elaine said honestly. "I need time, Richard. Time to process everything that's happened. Time to decide if I can forgive the lies, the deception. Time to figure out if there's still enough left between us to build something new." "I understand," Richard said, and she could see that he did. "I'll be here. For as long as it takes. And if, in the end, you decide to sign those papers after all, I'll understand that too." 6 months later, Elaine stood in the courtroom as the judge delivered Richard's sentence: 3 years in a minimum security facility, followed by 5 years of probation. It could have been worse. Much worse. His cooperation, his voluntary disclosure, his efforts to make amends to his clients all had factored into the relatively lenient sentence. Richard looked different now, thinner, grayer, but somehow more at peace than he had been that day on the cliff. As the bailiff led him away, he looked back at Elaine, a question in his eyes. She nodded once, a silent promise. "I'll be here," because over those 6 months, as Richard had worked to make amends, as he had faced the consequences of his actions with dignity and remorse, Elaine had done her own work. She had spoken with a therapist, had processed her anger, her grief, her sense of betrayal. She had asked herself the hard questions: not just whether she could forgive Richard, but whether there was still something worth saving between them, and she had found her answer in the small moments in their weekly phone calls that grew increasingly honest, increasingly intimate. In the letters Richard wrote, not asking for forgiveness but offering understanding if she chose to move on. In her own heart, which had been broken but was slowly healing into something stronger, more resilient, their marriage would never be the same. The trust that had been broken would need to be rebuilt, piece by piece. The life they had planned together had been irrevocably altered. But perhaps, Elaine had realized, they could build something new from the ashes of the old, something more honest, more authentic, forged in the fire of their worst moments but tempered by the strength that had carried them through. As she walked out of the courtroom into the bright spring day, Elaine thought about the email that had started it all, the photo that had nearly ended 2 decades of shared history. How close they had both come to losing everything, not just their material possessions, their social standing, but each other. Their chance at redemption, at forgiving and being forgiven. She thought about the cliff, about Richard standing at the edge, ready to surrender to his shame, his despair. And she thought about her own choice, to reach out a hand instead of turning away. Some would say she was a fool for standing by him. Others would call it grace. Elaine didn't care what anyone called it. She only knew that in the darkest moment of their marriage, when it would have been easier to walk away, she had chosen to stay and fight not just for Richard, but for herself, for the belief that even the most broken things could be mended if there was enough love, enough courage, enough determination to try, and that, in the end, was the only choice that mattered. So, what would you have done in Elaine's shoes? Would you have had the courage to look beyond the betrayal to see the whole truth? To offer a second chance when it would have been easier to walk away? Life rarely gives us simple choices, clean endings. It gives us messy, complicated situations that test not just our capacity for love, but our capacity for forgiveness of others and of ourselves.